you know, perhaps midwives are sensitized because of something that's been in the press about a particular incident. And when we were working at our evidence centre, what we would do when we were we filtered and selected some best evidence to share with the service, we would identify a commentator. So if we were doing, if there was a piece of research about 12-hour shifts, we'd ask a nurse director to do a commentary and say what that meant for her and her trust. So something about contextualizing that evidence, which leads on to step 3 about engaging people, involving the right people right the way through the study, as researchers often do. And obviously that's important so that the people who are your ultimate audience, whether they're social workers or ward nurses, can help you interpret the findings, select the outcomes, but also kind of find hooks and find the kind of windows where your research might have influence. So in the book, I use the example of a study that Naomi Fulop did on stroke configuration, where because the study team were working closely with some of the stroke clinical leaders, they were able to pull out some of the data at a critical point. They did some modelling work showing how many lives would be saved if the more complete centralised model used in London was adopted in Manchester. And the kind of 50 lives saved became a kind of mantra in Manchester, which actually influenced the decision for completely centralising that service. So involving the right people help you to have an impact by understanding better who and when to make a difference. And linked to that is my step 4, partner with organisations. So you cannot expect, as researchers, you cannot expect to have the kind of broad and deep connections, but working with charities, professional bodies, influencers who do have those relationships, you can really make a difference. And when we were at our evidence centre, for instance, we worked with an advocacy group when we were pulling together some evidence around learning disability services to create an easy read version for and with people with learning disabilities. Now, we couldn't have done that on our own. So work with partner organisations. And 5th is to make your content engaging. So there's a couple of chapters on how to write well, how to use narrative, use what one of the people I interviewed, Teresa Chin, called colourful content. So try different formats which might be appropriate for different kinds of audiences, and again kind of get help from people who can do this well, whether it's designers or communication specialists.
It's wonderful. That's really helpful and grounding, as I mentioned, for today's conversations. And I wondered if you can indulge us a bit. Could you tell us a few of your aha or sort of light bulb moments that you had while you were writing the book? And what I mean by that is, you know, those moments when you knew that this particular example or anecdote just had to be included in the book, and because it got you so excited about writing the book in the first place. Any come to mind for you?
Sure. Yeah, there are a couple of, I guess, like you say, those real penny drop moments. So one for me was, again, working at our evidence centre, we pulled together some evidence that was relevant to ambulance staff and services, and the kind of flagship piece of evidence was a big NIHR study, paramedic trial, which was comparing automated sort of Lucas devices with manual compressions for treating people who've had heart attacks, cardiac arrests out of hospital. And this big trial, it's one of the biggest out-of-hospital trials, found that there was no difference, that the Lucas, the mechanical devices, were no better than people doing mechanical compression. So when I read that research, first of all, kind of from my desk, I was thinking, oh, that's good, you know, savings for the health service, you don't need to invest in high cost mechanical devices. But at this meeting in Sheffield, when we were with medical directors, with paramedics and chief executives of ambulance trusts, many of them were saying, you know, we really like the Lucas devices. So if it's as good as, that's great, because staff feel more reassured, they feel more confident. And actually that's really important, that they're not kind of jolting around in the back of a van. And it made me think, gosh, the research findings themselves were only part of the meaning of the evidence, that it was interpreted and understood in different ways by that audience. So that was a real aha moment for me.
That's great. Thank you so much. I also had a few light bulb moments, and one of which was linked to the idea that it's the responsibility of the researcher to not unthinkingly push out research outputs and thus add to the problem of information overload. Yet the incentives for academics and possibly some other groups seem to steer them towards overpublication. And I wondered if you could comment on how we can handle this cognitive dissonance and how we can make sure, more specifically, what researchers and what funders and publishers, etc., can do to make sure that research that needs a broad dissemination, that matters, makes it and cuts through the noise. Any advice?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one, because I think researchers are in push mode, and I think partly that often comes from the universities. In fact, in the book I mentioned, there's a really interesting team at Cardiff called Inside Out, and they've done some interesting research on spin in scientific studies, and what they find is that the distortion doesn't often come from journalists being sloppy. They come from the university press releases themselves, who may be overclaiming for single studies and so on. And there's various incentives at the moment for individual institutions to claim groundbreaking research. So it's something about, I do believe that researchers have a responsibility to position their research, that some studies will just be foundational, will just add to the knowledge base in really useful ways, but doesn't always need to be promoted. So it's something about being judicious, about promoting in the right way, and also, you know, being aware, as you were saying, Stephanie, I mean, the noise at the minute, you know, I think it's said that, you know, a typical mental health nurse or doctor might have had to read 2 papers a day to keep up with their fields 15 years ago, and now there'd be more than 200 papers. So, you know, it's something about doing what you can, which is what I'm urging in the book, sort of doing the active work to get good stuff out there, but also being mindful of not just thought, without thought, pushing stuff out into an overcrowded. I think Paul Kearney says, you know, we're all cognitive misers. We need to, you know, be selective, and researchers should help that.
That's great, thank you. In the book, there's a really interesting theme around researchers needing to entertain before they inform, because of the vast amount of competing research and the forms of entertainment out there. So I wondered, do you think that is true across the board? Must all dissemination efforts be approached with this mindset? And if so, what makes a good story? What does good storytelling look like to you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's not about, you know, kind of telling jokes or, you know, unless it's appropriate. I mean, actually, I pull out some quite humorous research titles, but I think there's something, we all respond to stories, and I think, you know, it's quite a good discipline to almost kind of tell the story of your research. So, you know, what motivated you to start this study? You know, what were the dead ends? What were the, you know, aha moments, as you were saying? but also in bringing the research findings to life. And it's something about combining the stories and statistics. So, using examples, case studies, but then referring to the numbers behind that. I mean, certainly in the kind of patient safety world, which I worked in for a while, I mean, everyone could remember the Wayne Jowett's and the stories, but it was important to have, as well as those terrible incidents of, wrong route errors or whatever, to have the wider evidence of the numbers harmed and so on out there. And I think there's some studies in the book. I mean, one of them that came to mind was an ethnographic study of that Katie Featherstone did of resistance in patients with dementia and how they experience ward routines. And there was something it was so vivid, it stayed in my mind, but it was a very kind of robust qualitative study. So I think it's just about, creating the shape and structure to bring that data to life.
That's great, thank you. A final quick question. The book is well evidenced, logical, and I found it full of great examples, which altogether make a very strong case for investing time in dissemination. But there will no doubt be laggards in adopting good practice. And I wondered what your top tips might be for reluctant disseminators.
So I think what I've learned and what I've taken from the great people, including the panelists who we're about to hear from, is that, first of all, kind of simple is not easy. So it's really important to convey the kind of top line messages from your study, but you need to do that in a kind of a careful and nuanced way so that you are true to the science. You need to understand where people go, the channels they use, and use partner organizations, because they will know who, where the radiologists hang out, whether that's, virtually or whatever. I would emphasize, you need to kind of work with others and people in the book that I interviewed. For instance, Eileen Shepherd, editor of Clinical Editor of the Nursing Times, saying, I want to work with good researchers to bring some of your studies to life for my readers. So there are lots of people out there, the communication.com, the conversation.com, of people and platforms who want to help researchers reach wider audiences. And I think my last tip would be just kind of have a go, kind of exercise those muscles. It's a different skill to writing for academic journals, but practice. And I use in the book some examples of, one fantastic thing was, there was a Twitter thread of describe your PhD in 4 words. Describe your research study in 4 words. Be playful. Try out a few titles for your stories. Do a feature to the work of Ollie Williams, who did a graphic novel of his study on obesity and shame. We can't all, create a graphic novel, but just try a blog, try a political brief, a policy brief, and just you will get better. So and there'll be people out there who want to help you kind of get better. So I think that would be my final shot.
That's great. Could we invite the panelists up, please? And Tara, thank you so much for that conversation. We'll continue that with everyone else. And in the meantime, while we're getting settled, Tara, how would you explain this book in 4 words?
Oh my God.
Shall we pass this along?
So we've got a
I've got the talking spoon.
Oh, you've got the, we're gonna.
And I'm going to talk for the next hour, and I'm not going to let anybody else speak.
Yes, this is a bit like those kind of when. A bit like when toddlers have to hold on to something.
Yeah,
don't
that's
they?
what
So,
I'm
yes,
doing.
yes, yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask our wonderful panel to introduce themselves, but many of whom I interviewed in the book, and they're coming from different perspectives with different kinds of insights and experience. I think will really help researchers. So I'll start with the indomitable Elaine, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then each panelist is going to speak for 5 minutes or so, just about themes that spark from the book and their tips for researchers.
So I'm Elaine Maxwell, and I'm a bit of a mongrel, really. I've done lots of things, worked with Tara at the NIHR Dissemination Centre, and then the NIHR Evidence after that. I've been a nurse, done a lot in that space, and yeah, that's probably enough about me. Do you want me to
No,
I
think just speak now.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So because this is about evidence, I thought I'd use evidence, and the evidence says you should have 3 key points. So I'm going to give you my 3 key points. So the first is the so whatiness of the research. I see lots of research, and I had to read a lot of research when I worked in dissemination, which was frankly unclear to me, other than a very niche audience who it was for. I also find that a lot of people don't think about what their audience wants to know. People are on broadcast rather than dialogue. And that has been intensified, I think, during the pandemic. So I know that Tara was planning this book before the pandemic, but I think it's been really, really helpful to focus on this, because there's been an explosion of research. And it's actually been, it seems to me, a bit of competitiveness to get into the space of researching anything to do with pandemic, because it's fashionable and career enhancing. So yeah, I say what I think, as some people know. So I think there's something about why you're doing it, so what? And part of that is also situating it within the other types of wisdom and knowledge. So I've spent the last 18 months trying to make sense of the evidence on long COVID. I authored the 2 NIHR reviews on long COVID. And actually it's been a real struggle, because of course it's an emerging condition and there isn't a lot of research. One of the things that's been quite frustrating is trying to make people see that lived experience and praxis of professionals is probably better than academic research at the moment, because there is no definition for the condition. If you read the updated guidance that's come out from NICE today, it just says all the research is low quality because they've got very imprecise definitions. Well, we knew that. So that leads me on to my second point, which is think about the research in relation to other research. So another of my frustrations on long COVID is one day 80% of people who've had COVID have got it. The next day it doesn't really exist. It's all psychological response. And because I've read the evidence, I know that they've researched different things, but in the way they communicate it and the way journalists, I'm coming on to journalists, communicate it, it's become a battle of who's the most prestigious institution or who's the most prestigious researcher, rather than the nuances about where they're actually measuring different things, and both these things can be true at the same time. And that's a hard message to manage. How can 2 apparently conflicting things be true at the same time? So I think there's a huge amount of work to be done in situating it in all these other types of knowledge, because we know that practitioners work on their praxis more than they do on research evidence. And then the third point I want to make is use trusted sources. I'm going to make Shaun blush now. So Shaun has spent 10 years, first at, I don't know what it's called, this Express and Star, right, and then the HSJ, and then the Independent, and soon to be the Sunday Times. But he spent 10 years really understanding that context and that professional experience. So I know that if I'm trying to discuss something with Shaun, he understands it, but I also know that I'm reading something that he has written that is not an area I know, that I can trust it. I was telling him earlier, I actually turn the television over when some of the science reporters come on and talk about long COVID, because I don't trust what they say, because I know that it's untrue, because I have immersed myself in all the evidence on long COVID. So I don't see them as a trusted source. So BBC News may have a wider audience than Shaun, but I don't consider them a trusted source.
That probably goes quite nicely. So we aim to be independent and trusted as a What Works Centre for Wellbeing. So I'm the Executive Director at What Works Centre for Wellbeing, and we were set up about the same time as NIHR Dissemination Centre. So we were learning the evidence base together and trying out things very, very differently with very different audiences. So what we are trying to do is understand how we can improve wellbeing in the UK and reduce wellbeing inequalities. And we do that trying to democratise the evidence, so anyone in any sector can understand it, whether that's a public sector audience, a VCSE civil society sector audience, or a business sector audience, and try and accelerate that research. So play it back to researchers and research funders so that they can fill the evidence gaps, particularly the ones that practitioners and policymakers need to know the answers to. So when we were looking at, okay, what to use the evidence in terms of what we do as a What Works Centre, we looked at two things. One, we looked at what made effective knowledge brokers, and that was quite important because it showed us that yes, you need credible and robust research, and that's absolutely fundamental. But you also need to be relevant and useful and communicate well. And there's some great studies about the fact that if you tweet your research on Twitter factually, it just simply gets more people to see it than otherwise. So actually, it just needs to be visible as a mechanism. And we were also looking at, as I came at it from as a policy official and looking at how policy officials in government use and access evidence and experts. And there is a tendency, I think, along with shouting of headlines to inform fads, also whoever's shouting the loudest in your ear at that one time. So whoever's got the capacity or the space to do it. So also, I think policymakers need to seek out evidence, not just getting people to speak up. And actually that noise thing is a really important bit, and it needs knowledge brokers. So, and it also needs a sense of evidence literacy. So understanding that a small study with 30 people that finds red wine is better than white wine is fine, and you'll just find your preferences, but knowing how it fits into the bigger body of literature and why that's a more useful study than others. So as soon as a systematic review comes on the Today programme, I'm there listening to that because I suddenly realised that's much more important. And actually during the pandemic, we had double page spreads in newspapers looking at evidence quality and different things. And so that for me, that evidence literacy thing is part of everything that we do. But looking at what works for research use, we found 6 knowledge use mechanisms. And there was surprisingly little evidence for some of the things that are very commonly done, so events, networking, etc. And it is true, however, that evidence use is very social, it's very relational. So there is a combination, and who you trust matters and all these sorts of things. You can hear the same evidence from different people and trust it, believe it in different ways, depending on who's telling you. But those research use methods are really interesting. So we rely very heavily on 3 of them. One, I talked about already, about visibility and communication. You basically need to know it exists and what it says, and you need to know pretty quickly. So it's my job to read research. You talked about how the sort of information overloads and how hard it is to keep up with the field. I've got stacks of research papers on my desk that I won't, and it's my job to read it. If it's not my job to read it, I still need to know it in another job. You need to get that information to people when they need it. It needs to be easy, accessible, social, and timely. So it needs to be pushed out when I've got it, but also pulled in. And professional bodies are fantastic. That professions as a whole are really good as a knowledge use mechanism. But it also needs to be built into systems. And so the data that you need needs to be built into systems in an effective way. And that's things like NICE as well, and What Works Centre is a part of that. But also it needs so there's sort of capability and motivation and opportunity, but it also needs capability. And the only thing that does that is learning. And actually the process of implementation of evidence is one of learning and process and getting deeper and deeper into it. So CPD and professions are fantastic knowledge use mechanisms. So these are the sorts of things that we were doing and helping to inform some of the work that was going into Tara's book. And one of the things I do is take a research paper and flip it straight away. We don't do actually conversational blogs at all. We do very factual blogs, which is an evidence summary. So I used to brief ministers. And so you get the, what's your 30 seconds in a lift with a minister? You've got literally, what's your first point? Start with that and work your way down like a Russian doll. So what's your tweet? And I can no longer write in full paragraphs. I only write in tweets now. But other people need that depth of like, how can you find it is and where it is. And so I'd say you look at the evidence for research use and find out where you fit in it. And if you don't have those skills, bring in other people's skills, partner with people to do it. They'll know how to do this translation, this dissemination, this knowledge use. If you don't have, you're the expert as a researcher. So partner with people where you can.
Great advice from you both. I hand the box to Calvin. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, thank you. Before I introduce myself, there seems to be some evidence or research need to be done here on Twitter and tweeting. I don't know what this thing is about. I might have to look into it.
Somebody should write a paper about it.
I think they should, about social media and professional learning and research.
Sorry, there's some people who are lip read and the captions are not working. So could you look at the camera when you speak?
Oh,
Thank you, really clear.
oh, excellent.
I don't know where the camera is. Oh, it's there. Hi, camera.
Yeah, great. You get the captions sorted
Okay.
out.
So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Calvin Morley, and I'm a professor for diversity and social justice at London South Bank University. More importantly, I'm a nurse. And that's the way I think most people I spoke to here tonight earlier on, I introduced myself as a nurse, and I'm proud of that profession. And part of my remit at the university is that I'm the person, the lead responsible for the research strand from year one to completion of the nursing program. So we have a 3-year program or a 2-year program. I'm the person who makes sure that there's a thread of research across all years. And one of the things is I can teach research methods. It's really easy. You stand up and you teach qualitative and quantitative and mixed methods and how you integrate and how you analyze data. It's really difficult to get academics to understand and teach evidence to students. There's a big difference. There's that difference between evidence. So this book is wonderful. I think I told you that earlier on. It's something I could see my PhD students using because it's about how you write and you tell the story as well, how you integrate stuff, how you get that message to that audience. And more so, I work with people who we know the NHS needs a nursing workforce. And Shaun's written lots about that, I'm sure. Read somewhere on Twitter. But more so, you know, we need nurses who are able to use evidence. And this book really nicely translates that for us of how you can tell people about evidence. How do they actually understand? And, you know, I was telling you earlier on what part of my job role is. So in the year one of my students' nursing program, they go and they look for sources of evidence. And everybody comes back with the BBC website and certain newspapers, you know, because they tell you these are the sources. And then you kind of introduce them to databases and the other things. By the second year, you're asking them to learn how to appraise a paper. Go and find, you know, to get this article and appraise it and tell me what the evidence is around it. And the third year, you actually develop them into doing a literature review or actually undertaking a research project. And that's how I sort of, you know, build research through the program. But it's really important that when the students start looking for the source of evidence and knowing how it's been translated for them to understand it. And I think one of the great things about this book, it's downloadable online and it's free. So I can see where it's going to be on the reading list, how it's going to benefit my doctoral students. I mean, Professor Alison Leary's here, and Alison does a wonderful lecture to students on how to present data and integrate it. And you can see how all of these things work together. So I really enjoy it. And the other part of me is, you know, part of my role is about diversity and understanding evidence. And I think certainly I work with various ethnic minority groups. And I still work today with people who described hypertension as I have pressure. That's the evidence. I have pressure. You know, back of my neck is hurting me. My pressure is up. And if you don't understand what that means, it's very difficult. But that's part of how we begin to use evidence and learn evidence and how we translate it for different groups as well. So I think that was really important to get that across of how much evidence matters to different areas and how then that translates into us caring for people. So I think there's, basically, thank you, Tara, very much for, bringing the evidence to us. I'll pass you over to Shaun.
Hi, I'm going to slightly swivel this way so people can see me on the thing. So I'm not turning my back to the panel, but so this is really unusual for me to be in this audience. I'm usually at the back somewhere at events like this writing notes, but and Elaine's been very kind about me, but I think you've given me this platform, so I want to take the opportunity to basically just go on a rant as a journalist about all the things that really annoy me about science research and how this could be really improved if people just thought about it. And I think one of the things I first want to say is that people don't understand my job. They don't understand the pressure and the work that I'm under and the time constraints and how you can help me help you tell a better story. And so often if I get an embargoed story for midnight at 3 p.m, do you think I'm going to be able to do a good job at that? And there are far too many university press officers, bless them, sending this stuff out, and organizations sometimes who do it maliciously. It's not always honest mistake, but they send this out too late. So that's the first thing. You've got to give people like me the time to do a decent job. You've spent 6 months, a year, however long, researching this stuff, and then you give a journalist effectively 5 minutes to try and communicate your beautiful research. So I just think that's my first thing. In terms of the actual research papers, you need to be clear and write well and explain to the lay person. And I know in some ways research isn't obviously written for that purpose all the time, but if you're giving it to me, then you must want it communicated out to the general public, and therefore why not make it easy for them and me to understand. And Elaine actually stole one of the things I was going to mention. She said the so what, and actually it's something journalists are trained when they start out to answer the so what question. If a news story can't answer that question and make it relevant to your readers, why are we bothering to write about it? So just have that in your mind. The other thing I would say really is that when it comes to the papers, if you put a percentage in there, a percentage of what, and I don't have time to spend hours finding that full number. So I think there's just little tricks like that you can make really easy for me to understand what's in the research and share it. I personally would love it if I never had to deal with a university press officer about research. I want to speak to the researcher. And to be fair, the vast majority of universities are very helpful in that, and we can respond very quickly. But if you have a piece of research coming out and it's going to be embargoed at 3 p.m, then get in touch with someone like me and tell me it's coming, and I'm ready to work for you. I'm ready to help you out with this. And you have a relationship going, and you have to choose those journalists well. And I'm not going to stand here and say all journalists are brilliant, and clearly they aren't, but there are some of us trying really to do a very hard job in very difficult circumstances. We're trying to do it well, and we're there to work with you, I think, and we can do that if you work with us. And Alison Leary's in the audience here, and Alison and I did a bit of a partnership on a paper a few years ago now on safe staffing, and it was published in the BMJ Open at the same time as we did it in the Health Service Journal, and we coordinated that publication. It all went out very well, and I believe it went down extremely well at the time, better than perhaps most research. I think Alison said it was better than one of the best publications, and the responses she'd seen, because she worked with me. And I think that's really all my messages, that we aren't scary. We don't, we can be trusted. We don't hack your phones all the time, etc. So of course we love a scandal, we love a leak, we love a problem. But when it comes to research and science, that's not really what that's about. And I don't think you need to treat journalists with a kid glove, really. My only other aspect that I have, a concern I have, and it kind of touches on something Elaine said. During COVID, we've seen so many preprints published and reported on. It's been a really difficult challenge for journalists. We've really had to weigh that up because we just, didn't have the time to wait for the peer review process. But at the same time, we've seen so many of these then later retracted and changed. And of course, those don't make the headlines. It's been a really awful situation. Pre-COVID, I would never have touched a preprint piece of paper, but now that's changed. I actually hope we go back to proper peer review publications before journalists start writing about it. I think that's a real concern. And then the other thing that concerns me is that inequality in voices in research being amplified. So we see research from the University of Oxford for some reason has a natural weight to it than research from elsewhere, and I find that really strange. And also sometimes I have to say research done by nurses versus research done by doctors and professors and etc. And there's a problem there about what kind of research is getting reported about. Maybe that's a conversation for a different panel, but I think that's something that concerns me, is who gets the headlines and why. Is something I think journalism needs to think about, as well as the research industry. So I'll stop there, I think.
Can I ask you a question?
You may, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Here
Take
we
the
go.
box.
So you and I have at various times had conversations about something that I thought was really important, that you didn't think your editor would want to publish unless there was something else. So what do you think the editors are looking for when you pitch a story? So I can persuade you it's brilliant, but that doesn't necessarily mean the editor's going to publish it. What's the angle that editors are looking for that will make this more publishable? Because of course, if it goes in a mainstream media, it's going to have a much wider audience.
So I would say,
Shaun, do you want to
Yes.
speak?
so that's a good question. I think the answer is depends on the outlet, because you need to consider the audience that editor is considering and thinking about. So for the Independent, where I work at the moment, it's a very public facing outlet. It's effectively the general public is our readership. If you think about the Health Service Journal, those are NHS managers largely, and policymakers and decision makers. And so the editor will have in his mind, he needs to serve that audience. So it's back to the so what question. I need to be able to say to my editor that this is the story that matters for our audience, and that audience will change on the outlet. And so the message has to be tailored for the journalist to be able to sell that story to his editor, because ultimately any outlet is about serving their audience. So it's the so what question for that outlet's specific audience, I think. Of course, all editors should trust their specialist correspondents, but that's actually the case in most places I've worked, I have to say. But
Can I just come in?
Right. Yeah, no, do, Nancy. Yeah.
So I think there is a real tendency to think of getting a very big audience in a public newspaper, national newspaper, as the goal. And what we see is that from the data analytics is that, yes, you do get a very big audience from getting in a national publication, or one with a very big reach. And that can be very useful. It is not very deep often in terms of the engagement. So it cuts lots of hits to the site, but they don't go any further, and they don't want to. I think thinking very firmly about who your audience is and what you want to tell them, and who needs to know it before you decide what type of communications to do, which is what you started with. About don't start with the infographic as the idea, start with who are you trying to reach, and therefore what you do. So everyone's coming up with podcasts at the moment, like, okay, that's great, it's a lot of effort. Is anybody going to look at it, and is it the right thing to reach your audience, and why? And so I'm very much starting with who are you trying to reach, why do they need to know it? The other one I get is policymakers need to know it, and it's like, well, which policymakers? Do you mean the minister? Do you mean parliamentarians? Do you mean elected members in local government? Do you mean officials? Do you mean analysts? Do you mean, like, who do you mean? It's a very big audience otherwise. So getting quite specific on your audience is quite important.
I think that is a really good point too, about kind of targeted. Yeah.
I don't want to monopolize, but those are really good points, and actually reaching policymakers. And it's something that concerns me, that when I was at the Health Service Journal, I almost never received research that was useful to NHS policymakers and decision makers. And I've said both to Elaine and Alison before that there is a whole other world of research about healthcare, patient safety, and things that can improve the health service And very, very, very little of it makes it into the Health Service Journal, which is probably the one outlet read by most of the decision makers who are writing the checks. And which is why one of the reasons why me and Alison worked so well together, and it worked for our audience. And so I think that really troubles me, actually, that we have great research out there that doesn't get an audience. And when I get a story and I go off Googling, and I'll find research that was published on this, and it's just unknown, and it's sitting there with unloved, and I find that really strange and also really worrying that we know the answers to some of the questions we're wrestling with, but it's sitting in a journal somewhere that no one's read.
I mean, it's one of the points that Van der Ven makes about the kind of moral responsibility of researchers, that there is, as kind of public intellectuals, there is a kind of responsibility to get the good stuff out there, because as we've all said, it's a noisy world out there and there's a lot of unreliable evidence. So I think, and also I would really echo the point, Nancy, you made about the kind of targeted, it may be that in order to have impact, your research needs to reach, the kind of 200 people who are the system leaders for stroke, or, so, it's good to think in a focused way, as well as trying to make your work as successful as possible in the round. I want to just open up. So thank you all for really fantastic, quite congruent, but also kind of different perspectives and sort of challenges and support for researchers wanting to get their research out there. Are there any questions from people? Yes, would you like to say who you are? And
I'm Joan, I'm the head of communications for What Works for Children Social Care. So you've had a lot of really useful tips for researchers, and I'm wondering what pros and wisdom you can offer for communications professionals for how we can best work with researchers.
Yeah, good question. Shall I start with Shaun, perhaps? Any tips for?
Could you just repeat the question for
Oh.
people that aren't here?
Sorry, yeah, I've got the mic, haven't I? Yes. Sorry, we've got a colleague from the Children What Works Centre as a communication specialist saying what tips do the panels have about work that they would give to communication staff?
So I don't think your question was how could you work with journalists better. I'll try not to do that, or I can have a whole half-hour rant about that, but I won't. I think what I would suggest for you in working with the researchers, you need to get clarity from them for when you're passing the message on to others later, to people like me. And often I experience problems when the research hasn't been properly discussed with the comms side of things, and they have to ultimately go back to the researcher, which is why sometimes I try to just cut through that, no offense, because it's just quicker. And I think if there are some great communicators, actually, some great universities and some great organizations who are able to do really good job at this. But often that's because they've spent time and had time to speak to the research before and really understand it themselves. I think we're all time poor in this world at the moment, it seems. And I think that the more time you have with the researcher, the better the clarity of the message you then communicate. And that makes my job easier and my readers' jobs easier, hopefully. Don't know if that helped, but
Yeah, thank you.
So Elaine, just before you come in, I'll say one thing from my perspective is that something I remembered, which was years ago when I read Macpherson's report on Climbier, was that about joined up thinking and joined up working. And that doesn't only go for the health service, but it goes for how we all do things joined up. So I think it's how you have that relationship with your REI department, your research and innovation department, and how when people have applied for grants and they've been successful, so how you start communicating that outwardly, that this is so important, so much funding was given to it, and then you start to follow that up and you build that relationship. So by the time you get to the stage of giving Shaun, this has happened, people already know. So that's one way of how you build up that relationship. I'll pass you over to Elaine.
Yeah, create a pool for the research.
So I think it's important not to confuse simple messages with simplistic. And my experience has sometimes been that there is a desire to reduce things into a single message, which loses the messiness of the real world. And I'm sure you would never do that, but I have worked with comms teams in some organisations who just wanted to get it down to a binary, and some journalists to some extent, and they don't want to actually know that this is messy and complicated. So actually a simple comms message is really hard if you're going to be true to what the research found.
Yeah, just from our perspective, getting the comms team into the discussions with the researchers early on really matters. And I think you talk in your book about the process and involving people on. So we have a consultation group process for any of our research products. So we try and bring the audience and the comms people in as close as possible from the beginning all the way through. And different people have priorities at different time, but it takes quite a while, I find, to understand what the research is saying so that you can communicate it back, which is a process of learning, basically. And then working out how you communicate that as a summary is one bit. Literally, you called it translation. It is literally finding the words that help somebody make sense. And health research is particularly bad for jargon. Helping it make sense in a language that makes it that you would use. And I'm finding articles and going, oh, that's someone's put a Twitter, or a comment about that's exactly the concept I'm trying to explain with this research. So it takes some time. The other bit that takes really big time is working out what you do with that research. Often takes about 4 goes round. I mean, I spend £250,000 on guidelines or whatever it is, a process, but that even getting to something that is a more subtle, what do I do with this next, is really takes quite several times round. So my point is get in there early and go through it several times. And often your final graphic, if you're doing one of those, will often look very different to the initial graphic the researchers think as their way of explaining it. And they need to trust you to do that graphic completely differently because it works, but it just takes a couple of 2 or 3 meetings at least beforehand.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Well, yeah, Matt.
And Matt Westmore from the Health Research Authority. Fantastic book and fantastic session. Thank you everyone on the panel. We've talked a lot about research landing with kind of policymakers, decision makers, health service professionals. Would you give any different advice to try to communicate with patients?
Yeah.
Do you want to?
So again, I think the work that I've been doing on long COVID is really important here because the people with long COVID have actually organised themselves very effectively. The term long COVID is a patient-made term. It's really interesting because a lot of researchers won't use it precisely because it is a patient-made term. And there is something about the amount of information they have shared with each other worldwide on long COVID makes them real experts. And yet the interaction that researchers have with them from certain unnamed universities has been, we are the experts and you don't understand long COVID. You know, we followed up 40 patients who were in ITU in our hospital, and therefore we know everything there is to know about long COVID. And they say, so I'm actually a trustee, declaration of interest, of long COVID support, which came out of a Facebook group of 49,000 people who shared their experience. And so to say your experience of 40 people who are in ITU, it doesn't really cut it. And in fact, the latest ONS survey shows that 91% of people have been ill for over a year, never were even in hospital. So actually treat the patients as grown-ups, and sometimes they know more about it than you do, even though they haven't conducted academic research like you have.
I think the other thing before I hand over is one of the people I interviewed in my book is Sally Crowe, who's a real sort of patient leader. And what she said, which echoes something you said, Elaine, earlier, is don't underestimate the public. She says, you know, public can handle uncertainty. Yeah. And it's actually quite helpful to be explicit where there is uncertainty. So as well as the ambiguity that you you know, that you were talking about avoiding over simplistic polarities. There's something about that. And I mean, one of the things that is my personal bugbears is the over-reliance on, you know, readability scores, you know, things like Fleisch scores, as this is a way of, you know, getting your research accessible to the general public, because actually you need to check back. You know, there needs to be a clear but sophisticated distillation of a study, and that's not necessarily going to be measured by a sort of automated sentence length and whatever. So there's something about just testing out, if you're writing a plain English summary, test it out with your neighbor or your, you know, person in the bus stop. But also there's another great tip which someone said, which works. Read it out loud, you know. If you can speak it simply and clearly, then you will get the message across. Okay, I thought.
Yeah, I think it's a tip. I just want to rephrase your question in case the people at home streaming didn't hear it. It's how do we give the information to patients and public? Yeah, the research and the evidence. So one of the things, if we look at it from the, you know, we talk about the process of research, and right now we have a lot of patient public involvement engagement groups. And these PPIE groups, they really help us with, you know, deciding what the research is going to be and who we should ask and what questions we should ask. But we tend to discard them after that. And they kind of help steer us in the direction of the research. And probably we need to bring them back in when we want to disseminate the research and say, this is what we found. Because let's be honest, those of us who are involved in research and research is our work, it's messy. It's untidy. We go back, we go forth, we build charts in our head, in our minds, you know, we do all sorts of stuff. But then we have to package it really nicely to make it understandable, readable, digestible to the layperson, which should be the purpose of our research, to benefit, you know, particularly where health research is concerned, patient and public, you know. So what you then do is we could go back to the PPIE groups and say, actually, this is what we found. How do we say this now to this group? And then, you know, as I said, wearing, you know, my professorial title of, you know, diversity and social justice, then you get that meaning from different minority groups. I think you talk nicely about, you know, different types of evidences and the different metrics. We look at different people in different groups, and we all use different metrics when we look at the evidence. So I think those groups have more than to offer than we as researchers often see. Shaun, did you want to add anything from the journalism perspective?
I suppose I was just thinking in my head whilst the panel were talking, one of the things that you're told as a journalist in a newsroom, especially when you're a trainee by some wizened old news editor, which I hope to be one day. Actually, no, not a news editor, never do that. But basically you're told, how would you tell your friend down the pub? Tell me the story. And I remember years ago, a news editor saying to me, look at me in the eye and tell me the story. And I started to sort of write a top line, and he said, no, just tell me the story. And so then I had to sort of change my mindset. And then I told him what I thought it was, and he said, right, now write that. And I think there's an element of, you know, as Elaine warns about, we don't want to simplify things to an unfair degree, but there are inevitably ways to translate this stuff into a much easier, more readable way, and that's essential. And I think it's just having that mindset.
We've just got time for one more question.
Fiona Johnson, I work in communications for the Nuffield Trust, and I just wanted to ask about perseverance, because one of the things that I think is really, really hard for my research colleagues, wherever I've worked, is that the minute they finish with one thing, the data sheets and the pens and the spreadsheets are out for the next research project, and prioritizing dissemination and the persistence that's needed to, you know, to keep finding the audiences, to keep trying to engage them. I think that's a real challenge, and something. I'm just interested in your perspectives about how to create space, if you like, for the researchers to carry on. For me, research is not really much use for it sitting on a shelf. It needs to be out there, but it's really tricky for people to make time for that.
So I'll answer first of all. So I think hopefully most people heard your question. So how do researchers keep on with the dissemination part of it? I recently wrote a chapter in a book, and it was about beyond the diversity, equity, inclusion statement. So when we apply for funding, we put in this lovely little statement, but how do we go beyond that statement? And I think it's the same thing when we apply to funders. How would you, disseminate your research? We just write one lovely statement, and it'll be published in a journal. I would do a conference, the traditional ways. And I think what we need to look at is in that statement, really think how you go beyond the dissemination traditional statement. So what would you do? How would you actually do it? How would you build that capacity around it? It may be everybody's talking about Twitter. Do they have chats on Twitter?
Yeah.
You can have a tweet chat, is that the right term? You can have a tweet chat about, your findings. And that's disseminating, and it may just come to that very late term that we've all been talking about earlier tonight for certain groups and audiences. It may be, how we begin to look at having evenings like these just to launch your research findings. And that actually really goes through the dissemination process. I don't know if anybody else.
I just wondered actually if Jane Ball wanted to speak as a researcher. Do you want a box?
I was interested in a question. I was just going to sort of, Jane Ball from the University of Southampton. I was just going to sort of add to the question, which is thinking not just about how do researchers keep at it in terms of perseverance, but what are the system incentives or disincentives for doing that? Because I'm thinking about funders as well. What is their responsibility? Because if you fund up until the moment of a final report, and then you don't fund anything after that, you don't allow any activity, because you can't claim for time or activity after the end, then actually funders themselves aren't really committing to the idea that they want something beyond the report that they themselves are going to get. So I'm wondering about what the incentives and disincentives are that the system could be doing to,
it's a really good question. And I mean, certainly NIHR is doing much more now around enhanced dissemination and recognising that that needs to be costed as part of the research project. And in fact, certainly in the programme that I support, there's a lot of attention now paid, which there wasn't always, to the dissemination and impact strategy. And I think you can see too, as in your work, Jane, and with Peter Griffiths and so on, that there's often a nice kind of programme of work where you're kind of building from one study to another. And I think funders are starting to recognise that consolidation of effort, and also importantly that you've got that, as Calvin was saying, the engagement foundation, that you can't just start for individual projects.
Just completely. I mean, this is something, translation, dissemination, communication, and implementation is a thing. It's different to the research, and there's a number of different stages within that, and that often isn't paid for. You'll pay for the research or you'll pay for the activity, but not the bit in the middle. So that's my rant that I will do. But also there's a couple of other things that I will also rant on here that are important. So one, we see a very long tail on research. So we published things in 2014, 15 that are still used now, and they're new to people now. You go to an event, you're socializing some new research, having a discussion with a group of people, and they go, for the researchers, there's a whole load of things that are just common knowledge that are completely new to the head of strategy at Norwich Council or whoever you're at. And that's really interesting. So what we find is 80% of our audience is completely new to the topic. And what is completely common sense and knowledge for people in the field is completely new. So there's two different audiences in that sense. The other thing is about being timely. So research needs to, you can push it out when I'm ready to push it out, but it also needs to be timely, and you need to deliver it when someone's going, oh, wait a second, I'm doing this project. What do you know about this topic? And you need to be able to give the research then. So that's a thing that you're doing. But the last bit is, and about the sequential bit. So what you're assuming then is that you're doing the research and then you're doing the dissemination. I would argue that there's a whole parallel processing that is way more effective. And that's why the consultation process is really good. So it takes several goes around the loop to really understand what this is, what this might mean. And so that engagement process all the way through and talking about the work, not doing, just saying, hi, this is happening. This is where we're at with it. And then people start to go, oh, I'm looking forward to that. basic principles of marketing, but it's true. Like you need to know it's happening and go, oh, what was the finding in that research? And so building that into the process so it's parallel, not sequential is just as important as going, I've done my project now, I'm on to the next thing, but now I have to communicate it. So I would argue very strongly for parallel processing in terms of engagement and research. And I think that's just as important. Tell people are doing it.
I give Elaine the last word.
Just go back to the point I made at the beginning. We all know, and when we started studying, that no research project proves anything. It just adds to the weight of the probability that it's true. And we shouldn't look at research in isolation. And however wonderful your project and however likely it is to get you that wonderful professorship, it has a life in the context of other things. And actually one of the things we did at the Dissemination Centre for the themed reviews was go back to research that had been published and say, what does that tell us now in the changed circumstances? What does it tell us about a new piece of research? And that I think we're very bad at doing. There's always a new study and nobody says, well, how does that relate to the one 5 years ago on the same subject?
Yeah, knowledge and how
I have a number of thank yous to voice on behalf of HSI UK. Firstly, thank you, panelists, all of you, for your advice, reviews, and your very helpful takeaway points. Thank you to Policy Press, and thank you to Southampton University, and thank you to the audience. Thanks for being here, both in person, but also online. And a final thank you to Tara. Please join me in congratulating Tara for her massive achievement, from which we will all no doubt benefit from. Thank you so much. I think it's time for some wine and nibbles now.
But not for those at home, sadly.
No.
Sorry, no. Virtually.
And actually, sorry, I'd just like to thank too, not only Stephanie for her great hosting, but for HSI UK, particularly Helen Matiani and Rukia below, I don't know where she is, who've done such a great job of organising this. Thank you. And to Southampton University, who generously funded this to be an open access book, which I hope people can download at home. Thank you.